All right. It can only get smoother from here. Hey, thanks very much for joining me here, wherever here is for all of you in our new virtual community. And I'd like to especially thank Erin for inviting me and also the Girly Book Club, which I got to say, I'm just so impressed by this concept and the execution of this. I once tried to do a book club for guys, and it lasted 3 meetings, and I ended up as the only member after 3 meetings. So I'm really impressed that this is going on. I think it's a great idea and a great way to share ideas and books and socialize. I'm just going to speak, if it's okay, for about 20 or 30 minutes and then leave some room for questions. This is a big week for me, as Erin said. It represents the week my latest novel, The Last High, was finally launched. And to celebrate, I'm going to speak about this cheery topic, pandemics then and now. It seems like an appropriate time to discuss the history of pandemics and how they compare and contrast to what we're going through today. And also to talk about another type of pandemic, which I think is actually hiding in plain sight. I'm not sure if it's the case for this event, but often when I speak, especially at medical conferences, the organizers collect speaker evaluations, which they later compile and send me. And being a naturally sensitive and competitive guy, I take these evaluations to heart. So if you are commenting today, I'd like you to keep in mind that words can hurt. For example, in 2019, when someone said of me that Calla has the medical expertise of a Gwyneth Paltrow and the scientific credibility of a Jenny McCarthy, or in 2008,
Ouch.
or in 2018, when someone said of me that it's very progressive and inclusive of the organizers to invite a speaker who's quite obviously drunk. That one was fair. 2018 was a tough year for me. But in the last 15 years, I've been lucky enough to be able to combine my two careers, emergency medicine and writing. And in my novels, medicine is my gimmick. I always capitalize on my clinical experience in my writing. I've written about the dangers of superbugs in a novel called Resistance, the pitfalls of DNA evidence in a novel called Blood Lies. And I wrote a historical trilogy set around an Austrian Jewish doctor and his family who escaped Nazi Germany to the only place that would have them in the wake of Kristallnacht, which was the amazing cosmopolitan city of Shanghai. I'm particularly proud of this trilogy as it shares a slice of little known but vital history, a true story of bravery and dignity and survival during the Holocaust. But it all started with my first novel, as Erin mentioned, which was Pandemic, and which truly was inspired by my day job. If you don't remember SARS, I bet you remembered, if you hadn't up until 2020, I bet you remember it now. That was the first coronavirus threat that we saw and turned out to be a bit of a flash in the pan compared to what we're going through. But that spring, I sat on the Vancouver SARS task force as the director of physician staffing for the short-lived SARS screening clinic. And at one of our first meetings, someone put up a map showing this widespread worldwide hotspot. And I was struck by the scattered distribution of spread, in China, Paris, Singapore, Toronto. And I turned to the person beside me and said, how do we know this spread is random and not deliberate? And that's how the idea for Pandemic was born. Pandemic tells the story of a fictionalized bird flu-like virus that springs up in China. I bet that sounds familiar now. And terrorists decide to weaponize it. They use infective operatives as suicide bombers to spread the infection tactically and to try to hold the world hostage to their geopolitical agenda. Needless to say, their scheme doesn't pan out as planned. As we've learned from COVID, you can't control a pandemic. So I guess it's fair that one reviewer once said of me that Calla is like a Chicken Little with an MD. The other thing I often get asked is if my two worlds of writing and medicine ever collide. And nowadays, I honestly do see way more patients in the emergencies who have read my books. But curiously, the very first person to compliment me on my writing turned out to be absolutely crazy. She's a lovely woman and one of our frequent flyers, meaning she'd been in the emergency hundreds of times before, so she knew all of us. And as soon as she saw me, she said, Dr. Calla, I loved your book, Pandemic. And then she proceeded to tell me that she had stopped taking all her psychiatric medications and she launched into a series of bizarre delusions and just wacky thoughts. And later, when I was referring her to the psychiatrist, I told him that while the poor lady was quite obviously psychotic today, she did have this one wonderfully lucid and insightful moment. And then there are other times when my two worlds of medicine and writing seem to sync just perfectly. And funnily enough, that's often when I'm writing about end of days. and pandemics. So let's talk about some of pandemics' all-time greatest hits historically so we can compare them to COVID and today. Here's the top list in terms of deadliness of all-time pandemics. The Black Death, which killed up to 200 million people, is far and away the worst cataclysm the world has ever seen. The Spanish flu killed 50 to 100 million people, and smallpox killed 50 plus million people. But smallpox doesn't count because it took hundreds of years to accumulate that death total, whereas the Spanish flu and the Black Death did it in just a few years. COVID would have a hell of a way to go to catch up to those bad boys, and God willing, that will never happen. So let's talk about what is indisputably pandemic's all-time greatest hit, and that's the Black Death. The Black Death was a specific form of the bubonic plague caused by this nasty bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Most people blame this little bugger, the black rat, for spreading the plague. But in fact, it's spread by these things, these rat fleas. Rats are just the common carriers of these fleas, but many other animals are susceptible as well. The bubonic plague is still with us today. This sad, sort of funny headline appeared a few months ago, that of a married couple who dies from plague after eating raw marmot. I mean, why anyone would eat marmot, let alone raw marmot, it's a bit beyond me, but it happened and they died. And the bubonic plague is still endemic even in parts of the US, in the Rockies, and there are sporadic outbreaks in Africa and places like Madagascar. But the modern day plague is a shell of what it used to be during the time of the Black Death. So this is what the bubonic plague looks like and where it gets its name from. These are the buboes, the very swollen, discolored lymph nodes that appear in the armpits and the groin. And they're often accompanied by a severe systemic illness that can be fatal. The bubonic form of the plague is always spread by flea bites. But sorry, and I should have warned you about the graphic slide. In rarer cases, bubonic plague can spread into the blood system or to the lungs. And chest plague, that was so common in medieval times, is spread by human-to-human contact, like COVID. But the Black Death was truly the mother of all plagues. And it specifically refers to the period from 1347 to 1351. And by the way, it wouldn't become known as the Black Death until hundreds of years after. Back then, it was simply called the Great Mortality. So what made the Black Death so terrible? Well, first of all, the spread. In an age before any kind of real travel, except for a few traders and sailors, it spread from Sicily to Norway and Russia in under 3 years, suffocating Europe in a time before there was any real travel. The second distinct feature of the Black Death was the death toll, which was unparalleled. 25 to 50 million people died in 4 years, up to 200 million died altogether, 30 to 60% of Europe perished. The population of Europe wouldn't reach its pre-plague level for another 500 years. Now, granted, in the Middle Ages, there was no medicine, there was no medical science of note, there was not much hygiene, there was no public health, and no antibiotics. But the Black Death was still the worst natural disaster in recorded time. In fairness, the pre-plague Europe of 1340s wasn't a happy place. It was overpopulated for its infrastructure and food supply, and famine and disease and war were already rampant. But it was still so awful. Some cities like Venice and Paris had over 60% death tolls, and it wasn't uncommon for 1,000 people a day to die. They ran out of graveyards and burial places and just began dumping bodies in the water. Another distinct feature of the Black Death was the rate of the chest plague. Unlike modern day plague, the person-to-person spread was extremely common. Whole villages were wiped out in a matter of days. There's a famous medieval poem that goes, "Well to bed, and in the morrow dead." Doctors attending patients, priests giving last rites, and lawyers completing wills all died in droves. You know, aside from the lawyers, it really was quite a tragedy. I apologize if there are any lawyers out there, but I couldn't resist. But maybe what interests me more about the Black Death than all the death itself is the incredible and lasting societal and cultural impact of it. I mean, sure, it led to unspeakable suffering and death, but it also led to an age of enlightenment. The Black Death literally reshaped Western civilization, but it also led to so many oddities, like these clowns. This truly bizarre sect of Flagellants sprang up in Germany and France and Switzerland, and they believed that the plague was somehow God's punishment for man's sins, and the only way to appease God was to physically punish themselves. They would parade through towns speaking in tongues covered in their own blood and sweat as they literally whipped themselves into a frenzy. They became the rock stars, maybe more like the punk rock or death metal stars of the Middle Ages. The plague also led to unspeakable acts of cruelty. Parents abandoned their own children for fear of being infected. Towns boarded up infected houses with people trapped inside, leaving them to starve or die of infection. And in one of the first acts of organized genocide, Jews across Europe, especially in France and Germany and Switzerland, were killed by the thousands. They were usually burned at the stake after being blamed for inciting the plague, often by so-called poisoning the wells. It's one of the most colossal examples of organized scapegoating that the Nazis would later use hundreds of years later. In simple terms, the Black Death, like most pandemics, led to people to extremes of behavior. People became even more devout, believing they were suffering for their sins, or they became hedonistic and fatalistic in the ultimate live for today attitude. Just like with the Black Death, we're seeing a similar phenomenon today with, you got to bring guns to a rally to protest social distancing. And these people at the top who are handing out packages to the elderly. Pandemics really do bring out the best and the worst in people. But the Black Death also weakened the stranglehold of the church and ended the medieval reign of superstition at the time. Literature, art, and science all flourished. Also, because of overcrowding, the plague selectively killed off more of the poor and lower classes, so it led to a decreased supply of laborers, which in turn led to the empowerment of the working classes, and ultimately the end of feudalism. There probably wouldn't have been a Renaissance without the Black Death, which goes to show that pandemics can change society for the better. And it's digressions like these that may have prompted someone to comment on a previous evaluation. Cal's talk would have been much better if someone else gave it and didn't use his slides. So let's turn to pandemic's second greatest hit, the Spanish flu of 1918. What a piece of nastiness this thing was. The great influenza pandemic infected up to half the world's population, which was only 2 billion at the time. Up to 100 million people perished. And unlike COVID, most of the victims were young. The young adults were by far the most susceptible to this illness. Soldiers carried it home from the front lines at the end of World War I and spread it very effectively. In fact, more people died of the Spanish flu than in either World War. And as you can see from this graph below, in terms of mortality, it had 3 peaks in a dreaded second wave. In fact, by the end of 1919, the average life expectancy had dropped by 20 full years. Here's an army barracks converted to a makeshift hospital in 1918. Does that look familiar to anybody? So much of what we learned about quarantine, social distancing, and so on came from hard lessons acquired during the Spanish flu. An example of social distancing that's still relevant today is the St. Louis versus Philadelphia story. Both cities in 1918 had similar populations and they were only 900 miles apart. But St. Louis canceled their wartime fundraising effort and Philadelphia did not. More than 200,000 people congregated in September in Philadelphia for a war fundraising parade, and the result was catastrophic. Within 2 weeks of that fundraiser, that parade, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people died in Philadelphia, while far fewer people died overall in St. Louis. And you know what? It worked in St. Louis in 1918. It can work again here for the rest of us. We have no choice now but to practice social distancing. A century later, in the midst of another pandemic, I don't think anyone believes we're winning the war on infectious diseases. Look at these new infectious threats in 2020. I mean, if this slide doesn't depress you, I don't know what will. Moreover, in the last 50 years, we've seen the emergence of Ebola, HIV and AIDS, H1N1, antibiotic-resistant superbugs, and of course, pandemic is busy topping the charts again with its latest hit, the new kid on the block, COVID-19. As of today, almost 300,000 people across the world have died of COVID, and we don't know how many still will. And we can't talk about COVID without looking at a bunch of annoying graphs, right? But they are really important. These curves, we need to flatten them all. You can see that China did it effectively, and some other places that aren't even shown there, like South Korea, have really limited the damage or the spread right now of COVID. We don't know if it's going to come back. But places like US in particular, which has been so hard hit, have a ways to go before their curve is fully flattened. And we haven't won the war on this pandemic almost anywhere in the world, maybe New Zealand, but hardly anywhere else. So why is the flattening of the curve so important? Flattening the curve isn't intended to decrease the absolute number of cases, although it almost always does, as per the St. Louis example I told you about. But what it is meant to do is slow the rate of people getting sick to prevent the healthcare system and, by way of extension, the economy from collapsing, like it did in poor Italy for a month or two. The only real option we have for flattening the curve since we don't have you can't leave the house for any reason unless you have to, then you can. Masks are useless, but you have to wear one. It can save you or others or no one, if you can even find a mask. Animals aren't affected, but there is a cat that tested positive in Belgium, plus a few tigers here and there. They're probably Carol Baskins. The virus remains active on different surfaces for 2 hours, no 4, no 6. We didn't say hours, maybe days, but it takes a damp environment. Or not necessarily, depends if there's 5G. And finally, we have no treatment, except there may be one that apparently is not dangerous unless you take too much. Or it may not work at all if you don't take enough. So I don't want to be full of doom and gloom. I'm confident that COVID will end. And here's a few theories as to how it will end. It'll burn out through herd immunity and mass infection. This is the worst case scenario because it means a lot of people will get sick and die. I think there will be effective treatments, and I think it will involve a cocktail. It wasn't until we started mixing multiple drugs together that we really were able to suppress HIV and let those infected live normal lives. And I think it's going to take a cocktail with COVID to get it under control. There probably will be a second peak in the fall when the weather cools. The Spanish flu and most other influenzas have done it. But I don't think the peak is going to be as bad as some people think. Our surveillance will be better and our testing will be better. Obviously, the ultimate cure is a vaccination, but those are 12 to 18 months away and they present a huge challenge. And in the meantime, we've got to use social distancing, as I spoke of. And we might need to rotate through blocks of social distancing for the next 2 years, that when things settle down, then we are allowed to go out more and intermix more. And then when we have another outbreak, we go back to what we're doing today in most places. And obviously, it's natural for something as awful as pandemic, like COVID-19, to instill fear and anxiety. But there are times when I genuinely fear for the future of humanity. This picture of the guy smoking through his mask is absolutely for real. I mean, I think as a species, dolphins must have passed us on the intelligence scale by now, and potted plants must be nipping at our heels. But there is hope. COVID will not be another Spanish flu. Medicine, science, public health have evolved way too far. Effective treatments will emerge, and we will flatten the curve. We got this. And even though COVID is probably the worst catastrophe in all of our lifetime, never before have we been more in control of something. There's nothing the average individual can do about natural disasters like earthquakes or tsunamis, but each one of us can do everything in this case. It's literally in each of our germ-infected hands to stop this thing. I'd like to spend the last few minutes of my talk discussing a truly under-the-radar but devastating pandemic that's gripping most of the world right now, at least the first world. What I believe is and still will be the worst epidemic of the 21st century once COVID is suppressed. And one that I would argue is the closest thing we have to the Black Death or Spanish flu in modern times. I'm speaking of the opioid epidemic. It's almost pointless to compare these two crises and tragedies, but I'm going to anyway, if only to make a few points. The US is the country worst hit by COVID, and its death toll is absolutely tragic and staggering at 83,000 and counting, and the average age of death is 80 years old. But now look at the death tolls in the US from opioids. In 2017 and 2018 alone, almost 50,000 people died each year. More than 500,000 Americans have died since 2000, and the average age of death is only the mid-30s. You might argue that the opioid overdose is a lifestyle choice that can't be compared to an infectious pandemic. Maybe so, but this stat includes thousands of first-time users and accidental overdoses. Moreover, it's really time we acknowledged and treat addiction as the genetically inheritable illness it is, not a criminal offense or a stigma. And on the Canadian side, we're not doing that much better. We've had 13,000 deaths from opioids in the last 3 years, whereas COVID has so far claimed 5,000. But of these opioid deaths, almost all of them are young people, most of whom had to be buried by their own parents. Some of them tried fentanyl only once or didn't even know they were taking it. And many of the actual addicts might have kicked their habit and eventually led full and productive life. It's truly a colossal waste of life. The good news is that we're making a difference through some harm reduction strategies that I'll mention in a bit. The curve has been flattening with the opioid crisis in the last year or two. But unlike a viral pandemic, flattening the curve is not enough. That's still 40,000 deaths a year in the US, or 130 people every day. What's worse is that tens of thousands, sorry, I lost my slide. What's worse is that the opioid crisis is entirely man-made. I mean, I guess if you watch a lot of Fox News or Breitbart, you might believe COVID-19 is too, but the truth is that 4 out of 5 and arguably 9 out of 10 people who abuse opioids were launched down that disastrous path through the use of prescription painkillers, most of which were legitimately prescribed to them. Everybody, there's so much blame and culpability to go around for this, including doctors and especially the pharmaceutical companies. So what makes opioids so addictive? Well, they bind to the receptors in the brain and the spinal cord, disrupting pain signals, but they also activate the reward areas of the brain by releasing the hormone dopamine, creating a euphoria or high. And as strong as most users crave their next high, it's more often their fear of the horrible withdrawal, the so-called dope sickness, the sweating, restlessness, fear, nausea, vomiting, that keeps users desperate to find their next fix. Why do opioids kill so readily? Well, all opioids suppress the drive to breathe if taken in a big enough dose. For the victim, it's the equivalent of suffocating or even drowning in air. But the potency varies so much between opioids. It might take 200 tablets of codeine to overdose versus 1 milligram or less of fentanyl. And as I'll get into later, because there's no quality control whatsoever on the street, every time somebody uses an opioid, it's effectively like playing Russian roulette, excuse me. And the reason overdose deaths have climbed 700% over the last 10 years is simple chemistry. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than heroin. Superfentanyls, analogs like carfentanil, are 100 times that of fentanyl, or 10,000 times as potent as heroin. And while 1 kilogram of heroin and fentanyl cost the exact same to produce, about $7,000, that 1 kilo of fentanyl is worth $1.6 million on the street, whereas the heroin's only worth about $70,000 or $80,000. It's that huge profit that it makes it so appealing for drug traffickers and dealers to substitute fentanyl for heroin, despite the enormous human cost. This drug bust outside my hometown in Burnaby, BC last week netted the equivalent of 20 million lethal doses of fentanyl. And most of the supply of raw fentanyl is shipped to us or smuggled into North America from China or Mexico. In illicit fentanyl labs like this all across cities in North America, it gets cut into fentanyl by cooks with all kinds of products from baking soda to food coloring and God knows what else. And they process it with those pill presses into fake oxy tablets, what you see at the bottom of the screen there. And often these cooks will add ultra-potent fentanyl analogs like carfentanil to give the product a real punch and to save on the amount of fentanyl expended. But there's zero quality control, and the wrong batch, as I allude to in my novel, can produce incredibly lethal results. And you know, the greed and stupidity and malice involved in the criminal fentanyl trade through organized crime and otherwise is staggering, especially in Vancouver. The laundering of fentanyl profits is so well established in Vancouver that it's known around the world as the Vancouver model. But when many of us think of victims of fentanyl and opioid, we typically think of images like these: hardcore IV drug users living in a world completely detached from the rest of ours. Or maybe movie stars and rock stars who've lost their way, like these 3 major talents who died of opioid overdose. But the truth is, opioids do not exclusively kill hardcore addicts. The people often at the highest risk to dying are first-time dabblers or relapse addicts whose systems have no tolerance for the extreme potency of the drug. There are also countless examples of people who die from opioids unaware they'd ever consumed them. The victims come in all shapes and sizes. And the collateral damage is enormous, like that poor kid in that real photo in the bottom right corner of who's sitting there with his parents who both overdosed in the car in front of him. I've tried to capture all of these themes in my new book. The Last High is a gritty, realistic look at the opioid crisis in Vancouver, but it could be any city. It tells the story of an ER physician, a former addict herself, and a homicide detective who worked together to track down the source of an ultra-potent fentanyl that killed a group of unsuspecting teens and threatens to kill so many more. While The Last High is fictional and meant to entertain, the book does explore the perfect storm of greed, crime, and addiction that fuels the deadliest epidemic we have ever faced, or at least I have in my work. And I believe it could easily happen tomorrow, pretty much exactly as I describe it. It's also one of the most personal novels I've ever written. Working at an inner city emergency for the past 20 years, I've lived through the opioid tragedy, often on a daily basis. And this may be the most important message I've ever tried to tell. The opioid crisis can touch anyone. I want to read a short passage that I hope will illuminate how pervasive opioids and fentanyls are in our communities. And so for that, I'm just going to turn to the prologue. It's short, but makes a point. Prologue. The house music courses through Alexa. The hypnotic beat and melting layers of sound feel as if the hypnotic beat and melting layers of sound feel as if they come from within, as if her heart is the amplifier. And the warmth is so enveloping, like being lowered into the most perfect bubble bath. The bliss is almost unbearable. Alexa can't lift her head off her chest, but she can move her eyes. With a quick sweep of the room, she sees all the friends who matter most to her: Rachel, Nick, Joshua, Grayson, and Taylor. The only ones who matter at all, really. Taylor, her very best friend, is slouched at a weird angle on the couch beside her. Taylor had promised to ensure Alexa got some alone time with Josh at the party, even though she has a crush on him too. Typical Taylor, always putting friends first. Taylor's eyes are still open, but the pupils are tiny as pinholes. And her complexion, it's grayish blue, while her lips have turned almost purple. It's so strange, but so beautiful. Alexa shifts her gaze to her left and then sees Josh and Gray sprawled out on the couch, propped up only by their abutting shoulders. Josh's eyes are as glassy as Taylor's, while Gray's are shut altogether. They're both so still. And Josh's exposed arms are mottled deep dark blue. Alexa wishes she could tell him just how much she loves him. Tonight was supposed to be the night. Alexa looks down at her own hands. Her fingers feel foreign to her, and the color of her nails match those of Taylor's lips. She knows it's not right, but it's still so wild. The floating warmth intensifies. Alexa feels as though she's falling off the couch, even though she's not moving. She's never drunk anything more than a beer or two in her 16 years. How could one cup of Nick's punch make her so woozy? Somewhere in the back of her brain, she can hear her mother's panicked voice, a distant scream telling her to breathe. But her mom's nowhere near the party. Alexa finds it all kind of funny. She wants to laugh. She wants to tell Taylor exactly how exquisitely wrong it all is. But she can't even move her lips. Besides, dreams are stealing over her now, and she can't hold on any longer. I guess that's why they're calling it the feel-good book of the spring. But I do want to end on some positives and some cautionary notes. In BC, we're my province, we've made a difference. According to this study, up to 5,000 overdose deaths have been avoided in 2 years after introducing these harm reduction strategies, like take-home naloxone kits, the antidotes that users can use on each other who have overdosed, safe injection sites where people can be monitored and treated if they overdose, enhanced addiction service with addiction specialists, and finally, opioid replacement therapies. I mean, it used to be methadone, but now we have a much better drug in Suboxone. Unfortunately, though, just when we had started to flatten the curve on the opioid crisis, we're seeing another spike in death because of COVID. You can see that last month or 2 months ago in BC, 113 people died of overdoses, which was one of the highest tolls ever for a month. And the reasons for this are complex, but there's less social services available during COVID. Users are far more likely to use alone, ironically, for fear of exposing themselves to COVID-19 when opioids are such a higher risk to use alone with. And finally, the anxiety and uncertainty around them fuels drug use alone. But we do need to apply the same kind of aggressive approach that we've learned from dealing with the pandemic to deal with opioids, and we can make an even bigger difference. So what have we learned this evening, aside from that in this life you generally get the quality you pay for? 1, pandemics are inevitable. 2, we have survived worse than COVID. 3, good things can and do come from pandemics. We can also apply our pandemic response learnings to other crises like homelessness, poverty, mental health, and especially the opioid crisis. And finally, the opioid epidemic will be with us long after COVID-19. Not to blow my own horn, but I do want to end on a high note, and I thought I'd share this positive review I received in 2017. It was a bit dull and not very informative, but overall you did fine, dear. That was from my mom. So I don't think I've ever been more proud, to be honest, of a story than The Last High, because I think it's a good thriller and a solid whodunit. But entertainment aside, I really mean it to be a cautionary tale. I'm hoping if you have teenage kids or you know older kids, I hope they'll read it too and just see how toxic and dangerous and how easy it is to slip into this lifestyle. Honestly, nobody is fully immune from it. So thank you for listening to me for all that. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was very informative, and I especially liked your reviews. So yeah, we're going to open it up to questions, and there are 2 ways you can ask questions. You are welcome to raise your hand. There's a raise your hand functionality. If you go down to, my screen is different than yours, but if you go down to your participation, there's a button at the bottom, and then it actually says raise hand, or beside your name, you'll see a button that says more probably, and it'll say you can raise your hand there as well. Or you're absolutely welcome to type them in the chat window, and they can really be from any walks of life, whether that has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic or even anything that he touched on in his presentation. And Lisa already has 2 questions. So she says, do you think one reason there's this crisis is because opioids can be cheap, and how often do you write? Very different questions.
Yeah, Lisa, I think that's a good question. I think certainly, fentanyl is even more affordable to both, certainly, as I said, to the traffickers, but also the users, because it goes so far. So for a for a $25 5 milligram pill, they can get multiple hits. So certainly that's part of the problem. But even built into that is massive profit for the dealers and the traffickers. So it's a very hard problem to control, but it certainly does contribute. As to how often I write sporadically. I write in fits and bursts. I'll write a novel in first manuscript in 4 or 5 months, writing all the time wherever I can get the opportunity. Then I won't write for a year. I sometimes joke I took a little break between my first successful writing, which was like a postcard at 15, and then I picked it up again like when I was 30. But once I got back into it, I just get so hooked. And then my favorite time is when that new novel outline's been accepted by my publisher and I can launch back in. But and I work always. I find the 2 jobs are really complementary. People ask me how I have time, and nobody believes that I'm a very lazy bastard a lot of my time. But when I have things to get done, when I get hyper focused on writing or my work, I can be very efficient. So I find the 2 careers feed off each other.
Karen is actually going to ask a question live, so I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, hi there. Thanks so much for that. That was really fascinating. So my question is, so I'm only halfway through pandemic, and I was really hoping that the end wouldn't be spoiled. So thank you for keeping that secret.
I don't remember the ending, Karen.
Okay. I'll fill you in when so yeah, I was just really interested by the angle of it being used as a biological weapon, and obviously there's been talk about COVID, and I was just a little confused, and maybe this is something you could shed light on. So a while back, when the had been brought to light, oh, maybe this had been manufactured in a lab, I'd read an article which I thought came from a fairly credible source, and it was that in order for a virus to be manufactured, it would have to be manufactured on the basis of the sort of a backbone of a pre-existing virus. And so that's fairly certain now that COVID is not manufactured in a lab. But then on the news the other day, I was pretty sure I heard Justin Trudeau say that they're not discounting the fact that it could be a manufactured virus or something. So I was just wondering, if you are able to shed a little light on that for us.
No, after that very thoughtful question, my one-word answer is no, but I will expand on it. I'm not a virologist anyway, but and that's the perfect example of how much misinformation goes around about COVID and how things that we thought for certain one day are changed the next. The prevailing theory is that there's no way an RNA virus like COVID could have been manufactured in the lab. Even some of the conspiracy theorists were saying it wasn't manufactured there, but it was in a lab in Wuhan. They had harvested it from nature, and then it had either been deliberately released or snuck out. I don't believe that. These viruses, there's thousands of examples of these viruses that exist, and especially these wet markets, which are awful places for growing viruses, all the cross-contaminations between species. And every once in a while, one of them figures out how to jump truly successfully from one species to another. And I think that's what happened with COVID-19.
We have another live question. Amy's going to ask you her question.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi, Amy.
Near the beginning of the book, there's a line that says, pandemic. SARS put global infectious disease control measures to the test, and guess what? No one country came smelling up like a rose.
Yep.
In fact, most stunk. Do you think we've done any better with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, some countries, South Korea did really well, right? Singapore has done really well. New Zealand has done a fantastic job. My province of BC, and we were very lucky. We had a different spring break. We didn't have a lot of concerts or sports teams. We were very lucky in early March, but we've done phenomenally well in BC. And we've had really good leadership. So I think, I mean, I don't want to be dangerous for me to get in my views of politics about where it's been mishandled the worst. But I think in most places, we should have been more prepared for this because, as I said, it's the most predictable thing in the world that another pandemic's going to come along. And, it's a matter of when and how bad it would be. But the world, no, the WHO, nobody is getting A+ marks for me on their handling of COVID-19.
Thanks.
So if you want to ask your question, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat.
Tammy was raising her hand.
Oh, was she?
Can you?
I don't see that. I do have a question here from Andrea. She says, are you confident that a successful vaccine will be developed against COVID?
Yeah, there's so many, 108 are in tests right now. So I am confident, but the one caution is that they've never developed a vaccine to a coronavirus, which is the type of virus that COVID is. So it's going to have to be groundbreaking. So that's why people say it could take up to 2 years. I'm more confident person, as I said. I think we'll see treatments emerging. We're already getting way better in the hospital. We're already decreased mortalities in the ICU, figured out a lot of ways to just, some of it is nursing. I mean, our nurses have just been amazing, and so much of the care of COVID has fallen to the nurses, but just simply flipping patients upside down in the ICU so that they're what's called prone, so that they're facing downward on the ground. It changes the gravity of the distribution of fluid in their lungs. That's made a big difference, believe it or not, in patient survival. And I think medicines are going to come along. Before we have the vaccine, I think we'll find better therapies for treating it better.
All right, Catherine. Catherine wants to know if you have any thoughts on possible changes to the society that are similar to the ones that the Black Death and the Renaissance connection you made. She said she's open to suggestions.
Me too, Catherine. I mean, like, this is where I get to present myself as an expert on everything. I'm clearly not a sociologist, but my personal observation, I'm speaking to my friends, I'm sure you guys have found too, is that I can't believe the sort of, I mean, there's been some horrible acts like I talked about, but in general, the tolerance, people were suffering so much economically and health-wise, and people's priorities have been reset. This is compared to our parents or great-grandparents and who lived through things like the Spanish flu and the Great Depression, we've never faced an existential threat like COVID-19. And I'm hoping some of the materialism, some of the petty priorities that have driven us before COVID-19, when we're all allowed out and allowed in public, we'll have a new appreciation for each other and for gathering. And I'm hoping it'll lead to a kinder and gentler society, but what do I know?
Okay, Tammy does have a question. You were right. Okay, Tammy, I'm sorry. Let me just unmute you.
I think I unmuted myself.
Oh, we're good.
Yep,
Go
we can
ahead.
hear you.
Okay. I happen to be a psychotherapist, and I'm noticing an increase of people in very rough shape. People who've never been depressed, needing to go on antidepressants, which I can't prescribe, but I asked to speak to their GP and speak to their GP. In the last few years in Ontario, we have a college of psychotherapists now. You guys out in BC have something similar. In fact, there's 5 of them. But none of the colleges are covered by the equivalent of OHIP. I know it's not exactly your field, but I'm sure that you're seeing how people are having anxiety issues around COVID. Is there any way that doctors and other healthcare practitioners can work together to increase coverage for mental health? Because even with me cutting my rates and working at half price and sometimes at 30% of my normal fee, I can't help everybody that needs help right now. Like when people are out of work, they don't have the money, so I'm working for not very much per hour.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great point, Tammy, and I can't imagine the collective post-traumatic stress disorder that's going to come out of this for everybody. The isolation and
Going to be huge.
And I think it's great. It would be wonderful if they recognize that people truly need professionals to talk to. It's going to be more than just medication to get people out of that. So right now we're just trying to cope with the worst of the medical and I guess economic impact. But I think you're right. The next big epidemic to come is the mental health epidemic from this, and I hope we can make a difference. I hope we can get better access. So it's a great point.
Well, the people exist if social workers and registered psychotherapists were covered by OHIP, that would add a whole lot of trained, credentialed people into the system.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to take more.
But that would be a heck of a big start and not a difficult one because we're already in colleges.
No, not more from you. What I was going to say is I think it's going to take more than medical doctors. I think it's going to take everybody on the screen here. I think it's going to take public opinion, much more than what, we have. We have very little impact on our health authority, especially when it's starting to get things like coverage and stuff. It's all seemed as, they don't listen to us on that. But if the public rises up and says, this is an essential service that we need, then I think it could happen. But I don't know.
Thank
but
you,
I'll
Tammy.
support you. I'm behind you guys. Just don't have much sway.
Jacqueline wants to know regarding the development of a new vaccine in 12 to 18 months, what is the probability of the virus mutating and the success rate of the vaccine?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because viruses always do mutate. The interesting thing is COVID hasn't mutated that much, or when it does, it hasn't made much of a difference because it's such an effective virus. Viruses usually mutate because they can't find a host. COVID-19 can't stop finding hosts. And usually, for most viruses like these, when they do mutate, they mutate into a more benign version of themselves than a deadly version. So I don't think people fear the fact that that it's going to mutate into something even deadlier than it already is. And usually most vaccines are based on just a piece of protein, a piece of the central RNA in this case of the virus. And so chances are if they can come up with an effective vaccine to whatever COVID is now, it will have near complete coverage to whatever a mutated COVID would look like. It's the reason we don't die of influenza every year. in rates. I mean, one, we get flu shots, hopefully, but two, because our immune systems have seen something similar before. And even though the new flu is a new variant, it's not a whole new entity. Or like COVID right now is a brand new protein to our immune systems. We don't recognize it at all, or virus, not protein. But the next coronavirus that we had, if we'd been affected, will give us a kind of partial immunity. So it would never be as bad. Like that answers your question, but yeah.
I have a very selfish question.
Yeah.
And unless somebody asks one before I'm done, then we will wrap things up now. But I'm just curious if you have any, so in my mind, I don't really understand how we can just, like, they're going to open the borders in Ontario, and Ford's announcing everything tomorrow. But I don't understand how they can, like, how we can ever really go back to like the life that we had before, because I feel like they're just going to keep flaring up. So my biggest question is around travel, because like you said, like New Zealand has eradicated it, but as soon as they let anybody into their country, they're at risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what does travel look like in the next 2 years, in your opinion?
Like, not much. I mean, God only knows. Like, you know, those who do have to fly will go through temperature screenings and questionnaire screening. And I mean, if you thought security was big after 9/11, try picturing what international travel is going to look now. Because you're right, New Zealand can eliminate it all at once, but as long as it exists in Australia or Singapore or anywhere near New Zealand, they'll always be at the risk. And, you know, a study came out of Spain today. Spain was one of the hardest hit countries. And you would kind of hope that maybe 95% of people were already infected, like there was a whole bunch of asymptomatic cases, but only 5% of the population appears to be affected. And even in places like New York, only 20% of people appear to have already been infected, which means we're nowhere near herd immunity. So I think travel will be one of the most impacted things over the next 2 years until we have a vaccine. It won't be normal. And I don't mean to say that life will go back to normal. We will have a post-COVID life. I just don't think it'll be like it is now. We won't all be in our houses for the most part. But, you know, I think it'll go up and down. I think we're in a new reality now, you know.
Yeah, everybody's talking about the new normal. Okay, one last question. I'm just going to take Sharon's question here. She says, why do you think COVID-19 can affect people so differently?
Sorry, I didn't get that question.
Sorry, why do you think COVID-19, it's coming out in the news that it's affecting people so differently? Why would that be?
We don't know. I mean, it's bizarre, and it can cause strokes in people in their 20s. I mean, there's some predictable factors. You know, there's no question the older you are and comorbidities make you so much more susceptible to terrible pneumonia and dying of it. But it does so many bizarre things to the blood vessels, causes blood clots, it causes and they don't understand why. This virus, I mean, don't forget, it was born 6 months ago, right? And it's, you know, affected the entire world. Scientists are just scrambling to learn about this virus. It's not something, you know, we had SARS, but even SARS was different from this, and SARS never really took a foothold anywhere. So it's truly, you know, a new challenge and a new frontier, as it were, in medicine.
Sorry, you just touched on SARS, so I will ask Summer has also asked a question. She wants to know why you think an immunization wasn't developed for SARS after that event.
It's a good question. They tried, but because SARS burned out, I think it was a total of 9,000 people died, and less than 100,000 people, or maybe it was 1,000. I'm now forgetting the stats, but it was a fraction of what COVID has done. And people, it was kind of stupid to assume there wouldn't be another coronavirus coming back. So there was no, drug companies didn't invest a lot of money into the research, and it was short-sighted, no question, in retrospect. But at the time, it didn't seem necessary. Yeah, lack of interest in profit, somebody said. That's a good summary.
I'm sorry, Daniel. I just can't keep asking. I have to keep asking.
Yeah, it's fine.
Katie,
it's early out in BC. It's not even dinner time yet, so fire away.
Well, Katie has a good question too. She said, what would you say to those people that are not taking this seriously? And I have a second kind of follow-up question to that. And that would be, when like our government goes and announces the reopening, like what are your feelings about all of that?
Yeah, I think it's stupid. I mean, I think it's ill-informed. And the problem with the internet, in some ways, you know, never have we had an access to more information at once, and never have we been more misinformed at once. You know, everybody lives, you know, the tribalism that's going on across the world allows everybody to live in these echo chambers and hear what they want to hear. But to me, it's insane. You know, you have a president in the United States who handles the scientific press conferences on COVID. I mean, it should be run by the CDC. It should be run by the WHO. It should be run by the scientists who know. And until people start listening to that, it's tragic. I'm so worried in the US in particular, in the states that are reopening. I'm so worried what's going to happen. You know, I remember a month ago, the death toll was predicted to be 60,000 by the end of summer. Now it's at 85,000, and they say it might be 200,000 by the end of the summer. It just, to me, it's all very tragic, but I can't explain it. I don't know why people won't listen.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
I'm not happy. No.
I hope everybody picks up a copy of your new book. I'm very excited to read it. And yeah,
I know, Erin, can I say one thing apart from just thank you? And I know I'm preaching the choir. You guys are what keeps bookstores and authors going, but you know, bookstores in particular are struggling like everybody so much right now. And you know, I mean, first of all, as just one author of many, but just to thank you for supporting us and the bookstores, and to keep doing it, because it's just so important, you know, to keep our culture of reading and writing alive. And so thank you for that. And I hope you'll get a chance to read The Last High. I'm really proud of it, and would love, and if you do, I'd love to hear your opinions. You can reach me through the website or on Goodreads or whatever.
I feel like our opinions have to be better than some of the ones you shared tonight.
Yeah, they will. Somebody asked, by the way, those are not real opinions.
Well, thank you, ladies, for joining us, and I hope that you found this at least interesting, if not informative, and helpful. So everybody stay safe, and if you are a frontline worker like Daniel especially, be very careful out there. And thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Erin. Thanks, everybody. It's really nice meeting you.
Take care.